We're now on Daf Chafhei at Beis, Kiddusanya. And the Gemara is trying to reflect on this idea that the reason why you shouldn't be eating from the Beis HaShchita, the meat, right after Shchita is because of Derech Eretz. It's not something that's appropriate. And Kiddusanya, like we learned in the Beitza, lo yochal onam shum uvatzol meirosho elamei olav. He shouldn't start eating his onion by taking a bite out of the top of the onion or the top of the garlic, which is the main part and the part that he really wants to eat, but rather he should go through this side, the tzad ha'olim, where the leaves are, the achal. But if he takes a bite right directly out of the top of the onion, then the Beitza says hareze ra'avtan, and he looks like he's such a hungry guy. That's all he wants is to quickly, gouge himself and eat. And chayotzi bazelu yishta adam kos b'vasachas. He shouldn't drink down in one gulp an entire cup of wine. The imshasa hareze gargaron. If he does so, he's considered gluttonous. And that's not something that would reflect derech eretz. Then it says here in the note that even if somebody eats quickly before he takes off the hide, the skin of the animal, and before he cuts the basar into various smaller segments, even if that be the case, Rami Bar Abba, as we saw in Oman Aleph, was upset and opposed because it's not derech eretz. But he never meant to say that there's an Issa Treifa here, and he doesn't disagree with Rav Huna in Halach and Din, and he agrees that we don't have to worry about Treifa unless we see Simone Treifa. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Beitza, Shose Koso b'vasachas hareze gargaron. So you shouldn't drink the entire cup of wine in one shot. Shnayim, however, if he drinks it in two gulps, then that's called derech eretz. That's acceptable. Then you have someone who drinks small amounts at a time. Shlosha hareze migase aruach. It's indicative of been a feinschmecker, as we say in Yiddish. He's a very elitist type of fellow. He thinks so highly of himself. Drinks very small gulps, and it takes him a while till he finishes a cup of wine. That's already gaiva. The Omar Rami Bar Abba. Now another statement of Rami Bar Abba from which we could learn the proper behavior with regard to chash treifa. Chatzuva is a type of a grass which is called chatzav, and it has roots that are deep, deep in the ground. And that's why they use it as borders. Let's say you have Reuven and Shimon that border their fields, that border on each other, and they want to set up a boundary line. They use this chatzav, and they plant it in between the two fields of Reuven and Shimon, and that's a simon, so that these are the bounds. Mekatera glam derechia. On the day of judgment, the Rishonim will be brought to task because they should have learned the lesson of the chatzav. And that means that the chatzav does not spread itself, let's say towards the east or towards the west and sort of grab terrain that's not theirs, just below the ground in that same line. Be straight. And the Rishonim put their hands into everyone else's pockets, their chomsim and gazlonim and masigim gvul. They move the markers and the borders in order to steal someone else's land, real estate. So they're cheats. And Liyosid Love, when they come up to the judgment on high, the Chatzav is going to testify against them. Why don't you learn the lesson of a Chatzav? That's being straight, not trying to grab onto someone's Yenim's territory. And a similar thing we find with regard to Netiya. Netiya means if he plants Orla the first 3 years that the tree produces fruits, those fruits are prohibited. And it's only after 3 years, if you're very patient, then you'll be able to eat the fruits of the tree. And Mekater Raglam, that will be a castigation and a condemnation of them, liasid love, in the future when they come up on high, the Katsavia. Katsavia, which is a Katsav, and he buys and sells meat. He goes to the Beis Hashchita, and immediately after Shchita, he acquires ownership on the fresh meat, and he tends to eat it very quickly without waiting for perhaps hafshata, nituach, and bole nidos. A man's married to his wife, he has to wait until she goes to mikvah. She's a nida, but he has no patience. So in the case of the katzov, that they quickly eat from the animal immediately after shchita, before hafshata, before nituach, and sometimes it turns out that the behemoth is a treifa. And because of their chavizus, their chovzim, that's why they fall prey and violate the Isur treifa. And so to a man who is not patient to wait until after his wife is toveles and metayeres asatzma, he's a bold nida, which is chayav kares. What other phenomenon in nature could teach us how to live and fulfill the moral dictate of the Torah? B'chein turmasa. Turmasa is a certain type of a legume, and it's very bitter, but if you cook it over and over again 7 times, it becomes sweet and very tasty. And that's Mekater Raglam to say, Sonam Shel Yisrael. And Sonam Shel Yisrael is a euphemism for the people of Israel who sinned. As we'll see in Sefer Shoftim, they were guilty of the most fundamental of cardinal sins of worshiping idols, and they will be judged and condemned by the Turmasa. And we'll see exactly how that works out. Shenemar, the pasuk in the 10th chapter of Shoftim, castigating the Jewish people, they continued to violate the will of God. They did evil. One of the most popular idols throughout the early history of idolatry is Baal. They worship Baal. The Asa Ashtaros, another type of Avodah Zarah. We're going to count up how many different types of idolatry were they guilty of worshiping in the categorization of various gods. The Es Elohei Aram, that's number 3. Es Elohei Tzidon, number 4. The Es Elohei Moav, number 5. Es Elohei Bnei Ammon, number 6. Es Elohei Plishtim, number 7. Each one of these nations had its own god that they worshipped, and Klal Yisrael imitated all these nations. It's almost as if they were making an attempt to reach God through the idolatry, and they would try every type of idolatry and worship all of them, all 7 categories. And then the pasuk to top it off, Vayazvu es Hashem v'lo avdu. And the Gemara is going to ask, what did you add by telling us that they left God and they didn't worship God? Obviously, that's what's going on. In any event, Klal Yisrael generated divine wrath, and they did it through 7 different categories and typologies of Avodah Zarah, of idol worship. And they will be punished severely, and the Turmus is going to testify against them, because the Turmus is cooked over and over again 7 times until it becomes sweet. They should have learned the lesson, and instead of bringing upon themselves evil and parodios and punishment for 7 repetitious avodah zarah of each different sort of avodah zarah, without doing tshuva, God would have looked at them differently had they done tshuva and left the ways of idolatry. The Gemara asks me, Mashma shenemar vayazru et Hashem. Why does the pasuk say that they forsook Almighty God, and then it says for law of do, and they didn't worship? Is mimashma shenemar vayazru es Hashem eni yodea shelo avdu? What did you add by saying they didn't worship God? Talmud lo melo avdu, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Amar Kodesh Baruch Hu afilu kiturmas hazeh. They should have learned from the Bishul that the gods are not protecting them. The Bishul here in the Mashal represents all the pain and suffering that Klal Yisrael experienced in the exile over and over again, 7 times. And didn't they get the message that if they don't serve God, God is not going to protect them? They're not going to achieve any protection from other gods. That's painful. 7 times around. And then it's very sweet. You could eat it as a dessert. They didn't treat me in that same way. They should have understood from the Turmus that they could have rectified the situation if they would have only learned and derived the conclusion, the lesson from their suffering. He writes in the note here, Me'aturmus yesh l'adam lokachas dugma ketzad al yidei hayoso lokeh u'mityaser b'tzaros u'b'pgaim. All these pegaras. Yesh lo lefashresh b'masa v'losher b'tshuva lotzeis mimaves l'chayim l'shapech mimar l'masal. The Turmus demonstrates you can change yourself, a total transformation from one extreme to the other, from mar to muscle. At least after the suffering and the punishment, they should have learned a lesson and straightened themselves out. Lifnos Elah. They should have turned to the Ribono Shalom. At the very least, the Achash and Nisu Eskol Avodos Hazaros Halalu, after trying every single avodah zarah, it didn't help them, and they still were punished. They still continued to suffer. Now, once the Gemara mentions that Klal Yisrael left behind a Ozvu es Hashem, now the Gemara says that it's very interesting. The very same quality of their attempt over and over again to rebel against God and find an alternate service, an alternate deity, that itself, paradoxically, is the reason why the Torah was given to Israel. Could you imagine? Oh no, we learned in the Brisa, Mishmei Rabbi Meir, Mipnei Ma Nit the Torah Yisrael. What makes the Jewish people the chosen nation to receive the Torah? Why is it that the Torah is given to Klal Yisrael to study, lasot ba, lahagos ba yomam v'layla? The Torah is not given as a guidebook, how to do mitzvahs. You know, here you do this, here you do that, put your right hand, your left hand. It's such a technical a book of rules and regulations, but rather it's limud Torah, to learn Torah on the most profound level. They have a certain azus, I guess you translate it as chutzpah, and that has to be weakened. And how do they achieve that weakening? Lahatish kocha shel azus. It's through limud Torah. The Torah at its study on the deepest level somehow has a cathartic impact on the student of Torah, And it takes that negative azus, which is used, or I should say misused, for worshiping other gods. Let's do it my way, and that's the rebellious spirit. Channel all those energies and transform that azus into azus de kedusha, elevate it to the highest level of sanctity. And that's through the medium of Talmud Torah. Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, Pasuk at the end of Dvarim says, Mimino Eish Das Lamo. And Eish Das is the fire of Torah. Das is Torah. And it comes miyamino, on God's right hand. Omar Kodesh Baruch Ruyim Halolu Chetinase Lem Das Eish. The pasuk seems to indicate that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Torah to Israel with his right hand, which is a das shel eish. And why? Because Re'uyim Hem Shetinasein Lama, Lama means lahem, lahatish azusam, to weaken their midah, their attribute of azus, of chutzpah, of rebelliousness, of trying out other things and leaving God behind, and somehow to transform that azus and rechannel it in a positive way towards kedusha. Ika diamri. Others had Rabbi Shmuel's statement in a slightly different formulation. Daseyim shel elu eish. The way that the Jewish people behave, or shall we say, their isnagus, their observance of the Torah, is eish. They are azim, they are absolutely powerful and dedicated to the Torah like fire, alive and vibrant and sacrifice with the passion of fire. Imole, nitna Torah Yisrael, ein kol uma v'losh yicholim lamad lifneya. If not for the fact that the Torah weakens that azus, the people of Israel would be the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, and they would destroy all the other nations because of their powerful azus. V'hainu diyomer Reb Shimon ben Lakish, shlosha azim. There are three categories of creatures that have this manifestation of azus to such an extent that you can't beat them. They are so passionate and dedicated. And sometimes they can take on stronger foes and defeat them. Number one is Yisrael. Klal Yisrael manifests this attribute called azus, of a powerful dedication with passion. And that's amongst the nations Zorba Umos. Kelev Chebachayo, the Kelev, the dog, is a kind of a chayo or a behema, and very much azus. And Tarnagol Shabofas amongst birds, it's the chicken, the rooster. Yeshomrim af ha'ez, even a goat. The behema daka, amongst the smaller animals. Yeshomrim af hatzlaf should be lonos, a kind of mulberry bush. Now, in the case of the A's, I could just tell you the stories I was brought up with by my father, and they had back in Plisa and Lita, they owned a goat, and that goat was very powerful. He used to protect my father when he went to Cheder from the Shkotzim that tried to attack him. And this A's, which is relative to a wolf, a zev, a weaker animal, yet when a wolf attacked the A's, my father's goat, the goat was able to hold its own against the wolf. That's an amazing achievement. That's the azus of an A's. A's get shmo kenu. And my father told me, unfortunately, after the battle with the wolf dug his claws into the neck of the goat, and the goat became a treif. They had to sell it. That was the saddest day of my father's upbringing, because they used the A's for milk, which they sold to the Jewish neighbors, and that's how they supported themselves. The Mishnah says, "Chata basada lo yavi enu b'mot." On Yontif, we don't want to do an action which is derech chol. If it's so typical of what we do during the week, and it looks so mundane and secular, then it's pogea in the covet, it's a zilzul in the covet of Yontif. Tana Rabbanan, we learned in a Beitza. Now we're talking about Hotzah Mirshus L'Shus, which the Torah was matir on Yontif, but Ein Asuma Yotze B'Maklo. According to this Tanakama, in the Beitza, the Suma, the blind person, should not go publicly with his walking stick. He should only walk with it in private. And Lo Aroa B'Tarmilo, nor should a shepherd go out publicly with his yalkut, his knapsack that the shepherds wear during the week. Vein yotzim b'kisei, and we should not be carrying a person, a human being, on a chair, meaning we put the chair on our shoulders and carry the human being, which we do on a general basis for kavod, to show our respect for the person. But we don't do that on Yontif. Echad ha'ish ve'echad ha'isha, that is not whether it's for a man or for a woman. So the Gemara asks, Eini, is this really so? That we don't carry a person on a chair? Vasholach Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, Zokein echad haya b'shchunasenu. We have a transmission of Rabbi Yaakov that there was an elderly person in our neighborhood, vaya yotze, and they took him out into the public domain, big ludike. What's ludike? It's a type of a chair, shalo, which he owned, and this was going on Yontif. Bo v'cholo is Rabbi Yeshua Levi, and they came to ask Rabbi Yeshua Levi, is this right? Is this proper for Yontif? The Omar, if Rabbim tzrichim lo, if he's on his way to a drasha to teach the law in the Beis Medrash on Yontif Mutter, then you're allowed to carry him in this kiseh. V'samchu Rabboseinu al divrei Achi Shakya. There was an Amora by the name of Achi Shakya, and the rabbis relied on him to be lenient and permit taking someone out in the public area by carrying him on a chair on Yontif, and it was Lemisha ein Rabbim tzrichim, and it wasn't for the sake of his coming to give the drush. Diomar, because Achi Shakya testified that Ana Afikte l'Rav Huna, I carried Rav Huna myself personally, Mehine l'Shile, Mishile l'Hine, from two places that are located near each other. They're within the same tchum of Shabbos, and you see that you're allowed to carry someone on your shoulders. And similarly, Omar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Ana Fiktei l'Mar Shmuel, I personally carried Shmuel on my shoulders when Shmuel sat in the kiseh, and we went from Shimsha to Tula, Mitula Shimsha, which means from the sun to the shade, and from the shade to the sun. Anyway, we see over and over again the Amoraim would permit carrying on a chair on Yontif in a public domain. Gemara answers Hassam, all those cases that you mentioned, Kida Amar Taima, the reason is because, as Rabbi Shimon Levi had said it, Imayu Rabim Tzrichim Lo Muta. And Rav Huna was Rabbi Tzrichim Lo, they needed him to give the drasha, and the same is true for Shmuel. So that's the only situation, the scenario in which we could be matir, carrying someone on this chair, Birshus Aram, because it's Rabim Tzrichim. Amalei Rav Nachman L'Chama Bar Adno. Now, who is this Chama Bar Adno? He was Shliach Tzion, meaning he was a Jew from Bavel that was very careful about Aliyah L'Regel. He used to go to Yerushalayim for the Regolim. And he was a Shliach because very often he would carry Shmuos, meaning Torah, and transmitted from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael and back from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. Ki slika slahasam. So Rav Nachman turns to the Shliach Tzion Chama Bar Ad, but he says that when you're on your next trip, Eretz Yisrael, take a detour. Akif. Akif means go around the mountain. Vizil Asulma Ditzar, and go through the pathway of Sulama Shel Tzar, which is in the north. Vizil Lagabi de Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, and please stop by the house of Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi. That's where he lives in Sulama Shel Tzar. Uboymine, and ask him the following question. He say, Ma atun be, what is your opinion, Rabbi Yaakov, with regard to the halachic issue of carrying someone publicly on Yontif on a chair? Can we at least be lenient and accept the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Levi in a case of Rabim Tzrichim Lo? But Ada Azal Hasam, until Chama reached Sulma de Tzur to ask Rabbi Yaakov this question, Noch nafshe de Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi. Rabbi Yaakov passed away, and therefore Chama Bar Ada was not able to ask him this question. He's Solik. When at the end he finally arrived in Eretz Yisrael after he passed Tzur, Ashkechei Rabbi Zrika. He found Rabbi Zrika, who was a great scholar. Omar Lei, so Chama Bar Ada turns to Rabbi Zrika and he asks him the question. Kisei Ma'atunbe, what's your opinion about the Kisei? Omar Lei, Rabbi Zrika responded, Hachi Omar Rabbi Ami. Let's underline Rabbi Ami because we'll have to come back to this. And Rabbi Ami said it's okay for Rabim Tzrichim Lo, but only under one condition, Belvad Shalo Yikatev. Yikatev has something to do with the shoulder. When you stretch out your arm and you move something on your shoulders, that's called Yikatev. So the Gemara says, what does it mean? Ubelvad shelo yikatev, Omer Rabbi Yosef, Berei de Rava, be'alunki. So an alunki is a specific type of a chair that is lifted by two people that face each other. And when they face each other, one puts his arm onto the shoulder of the other, and the other vice versa does the same. And in this way, they would take a person on a kisei, and they were virtually carrying him with their arms, carrying the kisei. And that's a derech chol b'farhesia. That's a public action which is typical of a weekday, of a non-Shabbos, a day that's not hallowed. Because now it's really indicating that they're carrying him from one place to the other. And it's a much more effective way of carrying a person, because you're carrying a person on a chair, it's possible that it'll move and it's very precarious, so you have to go very slowly. But here, they actually grabbed onto the chair, these two people, with their arms, and then they could run with it. So Rabbi Ami said that even in a case of Rabim Tzrichim Lo, you're not allowed to carry him b'derech chituf. So the Gemara asks from a psak of Rav Nachman, Eini, is this really so that derech chituf is also in Rabim Tzrichim Lo? V'ha Rav Nachman shorile liyalta. Rav Nachman permitted his wife Yalta lemefek alunke to be carried in this way of derech chituf, in an alunke. So that even if it's not Rabim Tzrichim Lo, and even if it's derech chituf, it's mutter for someone who's be'isa, who's in a state of fear. And if you carry them on a chair, they'll be afraid that they'll fall forward or backwards or something. And therefore, in order to calm them down, even Rabbi Ami would agree that it's mutter to carry them be'alunka. So we have two heterim. We have one heter to carry a person the Rabbim Tzrichlo even without an alunka. And then in the case of an alunka, Rabbim Tzrichlo in and of itself is not enough to be matir. We have to add the isusa. Meimer Amar Zutra, Makatfi Luhu B'Shabsa Derigla. When a Meimer Amar Zutra would come to darshan in the Beis Medrash on the Shabbos before Yom Tov, and that's based on a Gemara in Masechet Pesachim Daf Vav, that Shloshim Yom Kodem LaRegel is Sholav Darsha Bilchas HaRegel. And the Gemara applies that even on the regel itself. So when they're on the way, and their servants or their talmidim, their students, were carrying them in a kisei, and it was b'der kitu. And the answer is mishum b'isusa. Once again, because this is a case like we saw by Malta, that they were afraid of falling, and the more secure way of carrying them, even though it's their chol, would be kitu. The Amrile and others say, mishum duchaka de tzibura, because of the tircha of the tzibur. The tircha of the tzibur would stand when the chacham came in to give his drasha until the chacham finally sat down in his permanent place for the purpose of giving his drasha. And there were older people and scholars, and they would wait until the chacham would reach his place. Therefore, we're allowed to speed up the process and carry the chacham bekitu. So it comes out according to the sugya, if we summarize, that if you want to take a person out on a kisei, it's only allowed for Rabbim Tzrichim Lo. And if it's a case of a kisei, which is their kituv, and it's Rabbim Tzrichim Lo, then according to Rabbi Ami, it's still prohibited. And it should only be permitted mishum be'isusa, and that is the opinion of Hamemar and Mar Zutra. According to the first Lishna, according to the second Lishna, it's Hotzas, Misha Rabbim Tzrichim Lo, B'der Kituv Muteres, Afilu, Shalo B'derech Kituv. Now let's begin the Mishnah with the following introduction. The Torah commands us to bring the firstborn of a kosher animal right after it's laid on, bring it just a few days later to the Mizbeach, and the basar is eaten by the Kohen. Unless there's a mum kavua, and then you're allowed to shecht it b'chol makom. You don't have to take it to the Mizbeach, to the Azara, and its ownership is the ownership of the Kohen. Now, in our time, we cannot be makrib a b'char behemoth Torah, so therefore we're not allowed to shecht it outside the Azara, but what we do is we give it as a gift to the Kohen, and we wait until Yirat Yistayv, until it becomes a treifa, and it has a balmum kavur. Now, if a b'char has a mum, then we need a chacham to determine, examine, and paskin whether or not it's a mum kavur and it's mutter to shechted, or it's a mum she'eno kavur. If he shechted it without showing it to a chacham, then there's a machlokas tanoim, and that's a Gemara in Masechet Bechoros on Daf Chav Ches. The Gemara later on in Beitza is going to quote this machlokas. Rabbi Yehuda's matir b'achila, and Rabbi Meir says it's awesome because he shechted it without asking the baki, the mumcha, the expert. Now, our mission that we're about to learn addresses the question of b'char b'zman hazeh, nafal b'mum on erev yontif, which means that technically it would have been mutter b'shchita, but he didn't show it to a chacham. He didn't get that final ruling that this is a mum kavu and you're allowed to shech the animal. Okay, now what happens is we're talking about a case where nafal b'mum kodem yontif, he has not yet shown it to the chacham, and now the animal falls into a bar, into a deep pit on yontif. And the bailim are afraid that it's going to die there, and yet, bechar shenafal the bar, we're not going to allow you to carry and raise up the animal from the bottom of the bar, because all that tircha would only be mutal tzorech achila. Now, if the animal dies, obviously it's an avela, you can't eat it. But if we haul it up from the bar, we could check it and eat it. But the only thing is, we don't know if it has a mum kavua or not, because we didn't get the es lechacham. Is Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yered Mumcha, let the chacham go down into the bar? He's the baki. He'll be able to determine whether it's a mum kavua and you're allowed to shecht it, or it's a mum over and you have to wait yira ad sheyistayeh. The means, and there he should examine the animal. We'll turn here to Daf Chavav, just to finish the mission. And Yeshbo mum, and he'll determine whether the mum is a mum kavua, it'll be materit for achila. Yale, if he announces and rules that it's a mum kavua, Yale, we haul up the animal from the bottom of the bar, v'yishchot, and we shech the animal. Now that's so, even though we didn't know in Erev Yontif that it was a full-fledged Baal Mum, but nevertheless, the animal is not muktzah because we were hoping that the Chacham would in fact confirm our suspicion that this is a Mum Kavua. So based on that hope, there's no Isa Muktzah, and when the Chacham determines that in fact it is a Baal Mum Kavua, then we can shecht it. The imlav, if he sees the mumcha sees the mum and it's not kavua, lo yishchot. We're not even going to allow him to haul up the animal from the bottom of the bar. Why? Because this is a tircha shelo litzara, because he cannot shecht the animal. If Shimon Omer, he disagrees, kol she'ein mumo nikar mibod yom ein ze min hamuchan. Rabbi Shimon argues that you didn't have a determination before Yontif that this is a mum kavua. You suspected it was, but you had no ruling from a chacham, and therefore it's not muchan. On Erev Yontif, we consider it still a bachar without a mum kavua. It's also b'shchita, and therefore you cannot prepare it for Yontif. And furthermore, lefisha ein roem mumin b'Yontif. We don't even, according to Rav Shimon, allow a situation where the Chacham will investigate and check out the mum to determine whether it's kavua or over, a mum over. Ein roem mumin b'Yontif. Why not? Why did the Chachamim prohibits for the Chacham, the baki, to see the mum? If they should nirik in a sakinis abachar, it looks like another act of, so to speak, shchita. It's a mati. By determining and announcing in his ruling that this is a mum kavua, he's being matir. And therefore, even if he went ahead and he violated and he saw the mum and he determined that it's a mum kavua, nevertheless, it's also to eat it on Yontif. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop. And Amir Hashem, pick it up tomorrow. Okay, then, thank you. Thank you so much.